Hi! Welcome to the first segment of this two-part episode about the three main categories we tend to divide our music up into: folk, classical, and popular. Where do they come from? What do they mean? And why do they kind of matter, even though they should also be taken with a grain of salt? In this first part, I'll be talking about the categories in general and providing a little bit of deep historical background for folk and classical music in particular. Then, in part two, I'll bring us up to present day and talk about the philosophical background behind some of the ideas we have about these categories. I did this a few months ago, and we're in the middle of a pandemic, so if my hair looks a little bit different, that's probably why. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get to it. I'm Peter, and this is We Need to Talk About Music. Categories can be pretty dangerous things, because as soon as you attach something to one, you tie it to a whole bunch of assumptions that come along with that category. The more we take them as real, the more dangerous they can become. But of course we know that categories are not actually real things. They're more like filing systems that are created by people, and they reveal at least as much about the people who create them as they do about the thing being categorized. That being said, sometimes a filing system is actually something we need, but it's important to be as clear as possible about how it's being organized. Hence this episode. Specifically, I want to talk about the three categories into which human musical activity is often divided: those of folk, classical, and popular music. These ideas are pretty familiar, and when I say the words, it very likely puts a picture in your mind. Maybe something like this. Because these ideas are so familiar, it can be easy to take them for granted and never really think about what they actually imply, or even why they exist in the first place. This has often allowed them to be understood in an extremely value-laden way. Classical music is sophisticated, progressive, and edifying. Folk music is naive, quaint, and pure. Popular music is manipulative, kitschy, and derivative. Now, of course, this is a pretty extreme version of a fairly old-fashioned point of view, but it's definitely one that's still with us today. What do you think people mean when they say that jazz is America's classical music? I'm going to try to avoid that approach by looking at music more in terms of its context than its content. At least for the purposes of this episode, that means I'm more interested in how music is used than I am in what it's actually like. Hopefully, this approach will avoid more problems than it creates, but we'll see. Okay, so it probably goes without saying that music making goes back pretty far in human societies. Well, at least making something we might call music. It's important to remember that that word has a specific cultural context, and it's a specifically European context. Every culture on the world has some kind of activity with tones and rhythms. Some of them are conceived very similarly to the way Europeans have conceived of music. Others are not, so it's good to be a little bit careful throwing the word around. Anyway, as far as how far back this music-ish activity goes, it's kind of anyone's guess. But considering that modern humans have been around for at least 200,000 years, and our cousins who are close enough to be called human, more like 1,000,000 years, it could be a very long time. As far as evidence, about the first thing we have is a flute someone made from the femur bone of a cave bear about 40,000 years ago. This flute, assuming it was actually intended for music, could be taken as evidence that some kind of musical activity had already been going on for quite some time. After all, we humans come with a pretty good musical instrument, our voice, pre-installed. More if you also count whistling and all the things we can do with our hands and bodies. So it probably stands to reason that people got started with what they already had, and who knows how much time could have passed before someone got the idea of modifying the world around them to expand things. So let's just say that human musical activity goes back anywhere from 40,000 to a million or more years. For the vast majority of that time, what we call the Paleolithic, people had it pretty rough. As far as we know, for all that time, people were living in small groups, going wherever the food went, and just trying to survive under ridiculously harsh conditions. But those people still found time to make something we would call art, and actually they were astoundingly good at it. Of course, it's only their visual art that we can witness directly. But if we were to irresponsibly jump to the conclusion that they were operating on a similar level musically, we might imagine something that would be pretty extraordinary to hear. But whatever music these Paleolithic people were making, it was almost certainly something that they were doing for each other, or just for themselves, or for supernatural forces, or even for animals, as part of their day-to-day life. In other words, it was folk music. The category of folk music could be described as musical activity that happens without depending on any mediating infrastructure. By mediating infrastructure, I mean a system that's put in place to support, but also necessarily to regulate something. In this case, music making. Some examples could be a church, or a school, or an orchestra, or a radio station. In today's world, these structures surround us all the time and are almost impossible to avoid. And this has actually been true for quite a long time. This raises some questions, like, is it possible for someone who's heard thousands of songs on the radio to play folk music? Is it possible to play folk music with a guitar that was made in a factory? Is it possible to make folk music for a paying audience? It really depends on how rigid you want to be with your definition. And this is actually a choice. Remember that these categories are only as good as they are useful. And what's useful in one situation might not be in another. Generally, I like to think of them more as poles on a continuum. And I don't really expect any music to be fully aligned with one pole or another. The second pole on our continuum probably started to emerge right around the time when the last glaciers receded and people started to come together in larger groups. This was largely a story of creating mediating infrastructures around the distribution of food, the organization of labor, the regulation of society, and pretty much all aspects of life. Now, I said that people came together, but they probably usually didn't choose to undergo these changes. I mean, would you? There's evidence that this civilizing revolution was probably largely spread through violence, and it was certainly enforced through the implementation of a rigidly hierarchical social structure. This, of course, led to the development of a social elite, and a set of elite practices and rituals associated with that group. Inevitably, some of these practices would have involved music, and over time there was a drive to differentiate this music from ordinary music, just as all aspects of elite life had to be differentiated from ordinary life. In other words, people began to cultivate a high style, and as this high style drifted farther and farther away from ordinary practice, it began to require a level of specialized training and professionalism among the people who made it. This, music made by specialized professionals in a cultivated high style for elite purposes, is what I mean when I say classical music. Now, once again, this definition becomes extra problematic in a modern context, because who qualifies as a specialized professional? And what qualifies as an elite purpose or a cultivated high style? When I listen to a Beethoven symphony in my apartment, is that classical music? When Bruce Springsteen or Beyoncé Knowles played at the White House for the Obamas, was that classical music? I'm being a little bit facetious, maybe. Of course, there still is a system in place, supported by universities, governments, wealthy patrons, that invest tremendous amount of resources in sustaining a tradition that is very self-consciously connected to this ancient one. I just want to point out that things have become a little bit more complex and multifaceted. There's another aspect that becomes really important when we talk about the classical music tradition of Western and Central Europe, and that is literacy. Actually, many ancient societies came up with ways to write down some musical information. In fact, probably the earliest thing we have that you could call a piece of music is what seems to be a polyphonic hymn that was written down in Mesopotamia more than 3,000 years ago. Typically, in the ancient world, writing music down seems to have been more of a special case thing than a standard practice. In Europe, though, a little more than 1,000 years ago, there were lots and lots of monks and nuns, and all of them spent a big part of every day singing, often singing specific words and melodies that were associated with that specific hour of that specific day. This meant that they had a whole lot of memorization to do. Now, this was doable. People were much better at memorizing things before we started writing everything down and got lazy. But it did create a training challenge, and so some people started to come up with strategies to make things a little bit easier. One strategy involved using little symbols called neumes that outlined the basic shape of a melody to remind singers just which tune it was that they were supposed to be singing. Gradually, other people, most notably a music teacher named Guido, who we'll definitely be talking more about in the future, started to find ways to add more information about the music to be performed. People also started to realize that writing music down allowed for a level of complexity that wouldn't have been possible in a purely oral tradition, although it also eliminated other possibilities. The system gained popularity, and by about 700 or 800 years ago, people were pretty much hooked. Elements of oral culture survived, like improvisation, which continued to play an important role into the 19th century. But despite that, there's no doubt that the European classical tradition from the late medieval period to today has been predominantly a written one. All right, that's where I'll close part 1. Make sure to come back for part 2, where I'll be introducing the German philosopher we have to thank for a lot of our ideas about music and musicians, and finally talking about popular music a little bit. It should be fun, so you won't want to miss it. For the meantime, stay healthy and happy, and don't forget to listen to some music now and then.